Hello, ladies and gentlemen, dear members. My name is Angela Lemauro, and I'm advisor for European Affairs at FEDIL. And I welcome you all to today's roundtable on the European Recovery Package and Industrial Strategy. So our speakers for today are Mr. Mark Nicklas, Head of Unit for Industrial Strategy and Value Chains at the European Commission, and Mr. Christophe Hansen, a member of the European Parliament. And for FEDIL, it will be our director, René Winkin. So in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the EU will have to make investments of unprecedented scale to guarantee its recovery. So therefore, the package presented last week by the European Commission on 27th of May, Next Generation EU, is worth 750 billion euros, focusing on the Green Deal, on the digital and single market, as well as on the social pillar. So in March, the Commission presented the new industrial strategy and 14 industrial ecosystem. So Mr. Nicklas, that's why I ask you now, could you explain how the European Commission's new industrial strategy will fit into and support the European recovery?
Yeah, thank you very much, Angela, and well, good afternoon, everybody. I would say it's a bit the other way around, because of course, first we came with the industrial strategy in March, not anticipating that we would need then really a massive effort to get Europe out of the crisis. And the recovery plan, in a way, is the first big, huge implementation measure, because it really is driven by exactly the same high-level policy objectives as the industrial strategy. So if we look at the industrial strategy that we presented in March, it's really three overarching priorities. And in a way, you mentioned them already in your introduction. It's first, of course, the Green Deal. We want to make Europe a climate neutral continent with a competitive European industry. So this transition to climate neutrality is the first big priority of the industrial strategy. And we always talk about a twin transformation. The other side of the twin is the digital transformation, really enabling European industry to benefit the most from the data economy. And to manage this transition to a green and digital industry, of course, we need a globally competitive and world-leading industry. And the industrial strategy in March, therefore, also had a new focus on strategic autonomy, avoiding dependencies on others. And these three objectives really are the guiding principles for the recovery plan. So the context has changed, but the priorities clearly remain the same. And the recovery package, of course, it starts first with really repairing the damage that has been done with the COVID-19 crisis, ensuring the survival of the European industry. But then also we want actually to use this crisis, turn it around. Each crisis can be an opportunity to take it as an opportunity to accelerate this transformation, the process that had already been going on for a greener, more digital and more resilient European industry. And in that context, also all the principles that we had, or the tools, I would say, that we had highlighted in the industrial strategy. We talked about 7 fundamental enablers, and they are also highly relevant in, I would start with the single market, which really is the most important achievement on the one hand, but also tool that we have on the European level to strengthen the competitiveness of European industry, to get the scale and the size of the market. And that is clearly what we have seen again in the COVID-19 crisis. The first reaction was often to close borders, even impose export restrictions, think only in national terms. But quickly everybody realized that doesn't work, because our value chains, they are across borders. We have European value chains within the single market, and the lockdown of one factory in one country, it disrupts completely the operations in another factory in a completely different country. So this single market dimension is also crucial for the recovery. Therefore, really first we needed to make sure that the single market works. And now to get out of the crisis and really into recovery mode, we need to look really at the barriers that hold our industrial ecosystems back and focus on those barriers that really are essential for the recovery. The other angle that we also had in the industrial strategy of March, and which is really a part again of the recovery plan, is the aspect of a global level playing field. On the one hand, the strong single market in Europe is the basis for global competitiveness. But of course, we need to ensure that we are in a level playing field. And there, the recovery package, in a way, continues with the same approach that we have laid down in the industrial strategy. That means it's an open strategic autonomy. We benefit from the integration in global value chains, from open trade and investments, but we don't want to be naive. We have the FDI screening mechanism. We are looking at the effects of subsidies in third countries and how they can distort competition in the single market. And we also need to look at a level playing field when it comes to climate ambition. So those are really, the recovery plan is an exact continuation of the March industrial strategy. And then, of course, it is really these drivers of the Green Deal, circular economy, and bringing industry to climate neutrality, decarbonization of energy-intensive industries, where the recovery package will have a lot of financing opportunities. And we have identified, for example, the renovation wave is such a flagship where we can really drive the recovery towards a green transition. Another example is clean hydrogen and renewables, which are clearly focus areas of the recovery package to drive this green transition. And then, of course, the overall aspects, horizontal aspects of the industrial strategy, like innovation, skills, and finance, they also remain integral parts of the recovery measures. Maybe one word also on this aspect of the ecosystems that you mentioned, because this is in a way a new approach of the industrial strategy, that we really focus on industrial ecosystems, which encompass all the players along the value chain, large companies, the SMEs, startups, technology organizations, service providers, which shows really the interdependence between industrial sectors, between the countries within the single market, so really the single market dimension, and which we really have seen in the crisis when we looked then at the impact of the crisis on the individual ecosystems, which helped us enormously to identify then what is actually needed. What are the investment needs for the recovery? And of course, then looking really together with all players, with the industry and with all the players in the ecosystem to help actually strengthen these ecosystems and making them again greener, more digital, and more resilient.
Thank you. René, do you have any comments or reactions to the industrial strategy and how it is continuing after the recovering is supporting the industrial strategy?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for being with us, Mr. Nicklas. And I think your summary shows that when we come out of the crisis, we see some very clear ways which we have to go. That's bringing back the principles of the single market. And I think as a small country, that's a crucial point for us, because without open borders, it's simply impossible for us to function. Then when you come to industrial policy, of course, representing this sector, it's clear for us that we support each effort that allows us to progress in that direction. Then when I see that the policy covers almost 90% of the activity, I think one question could be to say, is it selective enough? Are these really priorities, or is this not the general support that you have to give companies to come out of the crisis? And I've recently been to a call where someone said, and my sector is missing, you will have to add this one as well. So I think we will come close to 100% of the economy. So the point is, when you talk about digital and the Green Deal, are there not some elements like building up a hydrogen economy, like building up artificial intelligence capacities within the European Union, 5G, cybersecurity, renewables, of course, and to say let's focus the European effort and the transnational effort within Europe on these parts, knowing that the more general economy has to be supported anyway. But to say the European action to be focused more on what's really a big enablers for the twin transformation that you were talking about. So that would mean my remark, also question to you, the question about, is it focused enough, or isn't it too broad and then risking to fail because of that?
Well, it's a very valid question, and what we've done with these 14 industrial ecosystems is really, as a first step, simply to look at the needs, what the damage done, and the needs to get out of the crisis, and then also for the green and the digital transformation. For the follow-up actions, I would agree that in some cases, the action can be left probably to member states to look into their national recovery plans. How can they address the ecosystems that are particularly relevant for them? And on the European level, there is clearly some flagship initiatives, and actually you mentioned some that I had already mentioned, like clean hydrogen, and I fully agree, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, 5G, these are the kind of areas of really strategic importance, which certainly will get a clear priority within the European recovery actions.
I have another remark on coming out of the crisis, and that's something we hear from our member companies these weeks. Let's take the example of an energy-intensive industry like steel, for example, which is still a big industry in our country. You see overcapacities coming from China, and that will push to our market. You see that Europe is still front runner on ETS and the climate policy, which we share, but front runner, and the others are not following. And then you see that you rely on of course, on the cost of carbon. I think the signal that you hear today is that we will check if cheap imports from state-subsidized companies will not harm, although they are already starting to harm. So that's then the question of speed. How reactive can the Commission be to, for instance, deal with anti-dumping or with dumping practices? Then, second, the signal you say we check until 2021 if there is a need to bring in a border adjustment mechanism to see if the other countries are following or not, although we see now for years that they are not following, and we hope that they will follow, but do we still have to wait for that? On the other hand, you say within the coming months we will strengthen and increase the ambition on the climate agenda. So if I'm a company in such a sector, I would say what's visible is rather, and what's short term is rather playing against me, higher costs, imports from dumping practices, whereas what could help me, like a border adjustment, like maybe then a hydrogen economy, large-scale renewable, it's more the long term, and especially like border adjustment, a measure could also be announced much quicker. So and this in a time where this kind of companies now have to decide, where do we restructure? Do we need to restructure? And could this not play against Europe if we don't give them a clearer let's say, a view as for the coming years, and there I think we lack some ambition. If I see the agenda and the calendar, and so we lack some short-term clear messages for this kind of companies that are struggling at this moment.
Well, in terms of agenda, I think there are two different points that you mentioned here. On the one hand, a thing like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, it's not that we need to wait to protect Europe. It's simply that such a mechanism is highly complex, and there are very different opinions from different industrial stakeholders, and we need simply to carefully assess the options before we come forward really with such a mechanism. But that shouldn't prevent us from also giving clear short-term signals. And just to give two examples, we will in early July actually launch a Clean Hydrogen Alliance that then also brings all the players along the hydrogen value chain from the production to the industrial use together to really kickstart the hydrogen ecosystem in Europe and come to the scale not only in 2050, but much earlier. Yeah, and there's a high degree of ambition then also to really make things happen quickly. That will be followed up later this year also by an alliance on low carbon industry with a clear focus on the energy intensive industries, where we had already a master plan for the transformation of the energy intensive industries. And of course, we need to follow up and again do that together with the industry to take the action necessary and not to wait.
We now welcome Mr. Christophe Hansen, Member of the European Parliament and especially Member of the Committee of International Trade, where he is the coordinator for his political group, the European People's Party.
Mr. Hansen, 750 billion euros, 500 billion in grants, 215 in loans, plus 1.1 billion euros for the EU long-term budget. And the money will be channeled through EU programs to support the most affected member states to keep support where resilience needs are the greatest. But how will Luxembourg and its industry benefit from it?
Yes, thank you for the interview. And first of all, I think we have to give guarantees to the member states. And one, of course, is the so-called SURE program, which allows for the chômage partiel, like we say in Luxembourg, to be covered by EU funds. And it will help businesses to keep workers employed during the crisis. This, of course, is something general, not just for Luxembourg, but a direct help by the European Union. So this directly helps workers not to lose their jobs. And it also helps the national budgets, so as well the Luxembourg budget enabled to be sustainable over time. So in that way, the instrument also helps to keep the strain on national social security systems lower. I think that is very important to say. And then, of course, what will result from this program is as well a reinforced EU budget. And this will mean as well more solidarity. This will mean more Europe. So, and this will then, of course, as well be better for the single market. And we know that Luxembourg is one of the countries benefiting most of a well-functioning single market. So that is on that point. And then, of course, we have as well the strong accent put on the green recovery in this whole recovery plan. I think we are talking about the green and the digital transition for a more sustainable future, which is at the center of the recovery package. So I believe it's not would be the wrong message to step back regarding measures related to climate change, for example. And therefore, I will welcome very much that the investments for in clean hydrogen, for example, have been doubled in now in the recovery plan. This green technology, the sustainable technology, will of course help as well our industries to lower their emissions significantly. That's what we hope, at least. And then, of course, it will as well help Luxembourg to be on track when it comes to its climate commitments. Another point that maybe we should point at is that the pandemic has accelerated the digitalization of our workplaces. So we are doing this web meeting now online, and a lot of people are now getting used to work from home. This could, of course, help a lot if we put it and keep the good examples and maybe even work to make it even better, that people can more and more work from home. This would be as well important for the attractiveness of Luxembourg, because we know that a lot of commuters are coming to Luxembourg on a daily basis. They are stuck in traffic jams. So if we could help with this new telework elements to decongest our streets, our roads, that would help a lot. And of course, this is as well time gained for the employers and the employees in the end, if people are less tired because of traveling. So I think that is very important. We have as well the strategic investment facility to invest in key value chains, which is crucial for Europe's future resilience and the so-called strategic autonomy. And here we have, of course, as well take up the lessons learned now from the corona crisis. We know that in a lot of sectors, let's take the medical sector, for example, depends heavily on single suppliers indeed. So, for example, when it comes to antibiotics, the European manufacturers get their active substances 19 to 100% from China or from India. This is a strong dependency, which we now see is as well a weakness. So we have to make sure, and we are now working as well on a report on the common commercial policy, where I'm asking as well to build up a plan and as well a fund for strategic diversification. I think that is important, that we help industry as well to get these new funds. And while we can say that the proposal by the Commission is quite ambitious, but on the other hand, the European Parliament has asked for almost 3 times the amount that the Commission now has put on the table. We know that this will already be a huge effort for the member states, but on the other hand, there are as well solutions how to feed in this recovery fund with, for example, own resources that in principle are allowed by the treaties for the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. Hansen. René, could you briefly explain how FEDIL sees this problematic?
I would first say that let's say the likelihood of certain measures announced by the Commissions might be higher than likelihood of others. I think there are some short-term announcements and others that also depend on the fact that you manage to get the financial means to do so. I take 2 examples for instance, on the climate agenda. I think enforcing now the targets is something that could be done in autumn without any budget. The other hand, as you mentioned, the hydrogen infrastructure, or even new or speeding up the investment on the grids, transporter grids, on in the renewables, very much relies on financial capacity, especially on those in these member states that have most suffered to bring up the finance to do so. And that's, I think, a risk that we see from the industry side, that those actions that are the most likely to happen could be those that companies could be afraid of if they are not well framed with other measures. If for instance, the Commission says we have to wait for 2021 to see if Europe is still standing alone on its climate policy, and then we see if we need border adjustment. I know that's not something, that's also what we heard from the Commission, not something that you can decide from one day to another. On the other hand, if you don't give this framework to the companies and then you announce to them that could even enforce the targets, that could also be a negative target. So I think it's very important that the package is completed. I think the package goes into the right direction, but I think uncompleted, and knowing that the likelihood is not the same for all the measures, there can be a certain risk. Secondly, I think you mentioned those strategic value chains and the fact that we should diversify more production in Europe, and that's something we welcome from an industrial policy point of view. On the other hand, we know that this cannot be separated from keeping us open for the global markets. I think also in Parliament, I think it's important to stress that one does not exclude the others. And I think the experience that Luxembourg, especially Luxembourg, has made during the pandemic shows that globalization is partially the solution as well. So it has to be a mix of enforcing several key industries, and then second, keeping global markets open, but on fair conditions, of course. And then also next generation of commercial agreements seems to be very, very important. I don't know if you want to react on these 2 points.
Yes, first of all, I think it is important what you say. The Parliament is not just looking on reshoring certain industries to the European Union, but it's as well to help our industries, firstly, maybe to manufacture indeed in the European Union, but secondly, get access to other markets. And I think that is something very important. A lot of people are now contesting a little bit, or even blaming free trade for the current situation. I think that is really the wrong message, because we have now during the crisis suffered many problems of supply from countries where we don't have a free trade agreement. That is something we have to underline. So what I would say is as well, we have to diversify our markets. And there we are now talking about, we are in the ratification process of the EU-Mexico agreement. We are in the ratification process of the EU-Mercosur agreement. But then as well, we have to look a little bit more to Asia as well, I think, because we are only concentrating on China, but there are a lot of other countries in Asia that are really of interest for us, but we are not too much touching upon them because we are a little bit afraid about the reaction of China. But when we are talking to experts and they talk on off, they say, well, you can do anything with China, you can't negotiate. So why aren't we being more? We concluded now a deal with Japan. We have now one with Vietnam. So we are putting already pressure, but there are other countries where we have to see. Maybe Taiwan. We are always saying, well, the Chinese brought us so many respiratory masks to the European Union, but Taiwan did as well. They have the facilities. And I think it's as well, we have to be more offensive on these markets, because this will firstly bring opportunities to our businesses, and secondly, as well, diversify, as I say, the origin of the products that are needed for our manufacturing process in the European Union. You are talking about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Of course, this is as well a part of the own resources portfolio that the Commission is putting forward. On the other hand, this is something that lies in the future. So this is, of course, and the legislation is not on the table yet. The Commission firstly was talking about a carbon border tax. Now it's the mechanism. The mechanism is already a better term. But on the other hand, we have to make sure that this is as well WTO compliant. I've been recently in Geneva and talking to some ambassadors from third countries, and they are not willing to talk about, because they say this is a potential dispute at WTO level. So we have to be still on that, because of course, let's take again China, for example. In the steel industry, they have a huge overproduction, and if they would, for example, produce steel coming from with clean energy just for the European market, this would be a small percentage of their overall production. So there's some euros that they would pay as a border adjustment would not hamper their competitiveness towards our industry. So we have to be careful. They could do it easily. For them, it's just some euros more, but they can spread it over a large production. So there's a lot of thinking still to be made. The Commission was very ambitious to say, well, this is one of the Green Deal that will come very early in the beginning of the term of Mrs. von der Leyen. On the other hand, I think the really thorough impact assessment still needs to be done, and as well to be checked if this is compatible with the WTO rules. And what we hear so far, there might be huge problems.
I think if and I think you can have mixed feelings about border adjustment mechanisms, but then let's say if that could not work, if we would find out find out that this is not the right way to go, we might come back on keeping free allocation as a means to avoid carbon leakage. But then you lose, of course, part of the financial resources that the Commission has already planned in. So I think that's a bit tricky then as a way forward. Second, on this reinforcement of the industrial landscape, the Commission is also talking about raw materials policy. Could you elaborate a bit on how you see this in Parliament? What could be a raw materials policy? Because some of these raw materials are not on our continent. Do you see this in the framework of international trade agreements, or what other options do we have in Europe to bring this into the package?
Well, I believe on raw materials, we know that, as you rightly stated, we have not sufficient resources on our continent to feed in our industrial production. I think that is a thing we have to admit. The Commission is clearly looking at Africa as well, because in Africa we have a lot of potential, and we have very little agreements so far. So I think there is a huge effort to be made, and this goes, of course, through many aspects. We are talking as well, and that's something my political group is bringing up. We know, of course, that many African countries have a big amount of debt towards the European Union. I think it's now good to have a bridge building exercise to say, well, because we know if we don't have them economically, this debt will anyhow never be reimbursed. So better, let's say, this debt is now cut. We will not talk about it, but on the other hand, we work more constructively together to get new suppliers, to get sustainable suppliers, let's say, and help them to not be the victim of the Chinese, because what the Chinese are doing in Africa is post-colonialism, and of course, this is as well due a little bit to the political, to the young democracies that are in these countries. So we have to have a multi approach on development, on political support, and on financial support to get closer to the African continent, which is closer than Mercosur, which is closer than China. So there, I think there is a huge effort to make, and the Commission has put on track as well the Africa strategy, which goes into this direction.
Okay, thank you very much for the interesting debate. We talked about a lot of things. The Commission's ambition is big, and we support this ambition. However, we see that some questions remain open. We think that more clarity maybe is needed on the link with the strategic approach of this recovery, and also on the link of how will businesses and citizens benefit from this recovery package beyond the twin transition and the trade strategies that we talked about now. So thank you very much for the discussion today, and see you soon.
Thank you very much.